Hello there, dear listener. Thank you for joining me tonight for another quiet walk through the winding corridors of history. Whether you find yourself tucked beneath warm blankets, drifting off to sleep, or simply seeking a gentle escape from the noise of modern life, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time with me. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from. It always warms my heart to see the reach of our calm little corner of the internet. And if these peaceful explorations of the past bring you comfort, I'd be honored if you subscribed. But for now, take a slow breath, let your shoulders relax, and allow your mind to drift back in time to a very different world. A world where the line between science and superstition was as thin as a breath on cold glass, where sickness was feared more than swords, and where one man or woman in a village might carry the fragile hope of many. Tonight, we begin our story of what it was like to be a doctor in the Middle Ages. Picture it, if you will. A small stone house nestled at the edge of a village, its thatched roof sagging slightly with age. The sun has long since dipped below the hills, and the faint glow of a tallow candle flickers behind a thick glass pane. Inside, a man in his middle years bends over a wooden table, the surface stained with tinctures and inks, the air rich with the scent of dried herbs and old parchment. This is no wealthy physician of courtly fame. No, this is a village healer, a doctor of sorts, though he would not call himself that. Not out loud. He is a man of modest means, but deep knowledge, hard won through years of observation, trial, and quiet prayer. A soft knock at the door draws him from his notes. It is late, and only illness comes calling at such an hour. He rises slowly, pulling his worn cloak around his shoulders, and unlatches the heavy door. A young woman stands before him, pale and shivering, her hand resting protectively on a rounded belly. Her husband stands behind her, eyes wide with fear, cradling a bundle of linens. Without a word, the doctor steps aside and beckons them in. He does not ask what is wrong. He sees it clearly in her face. In the Middle Ages, medicine was an uncertain craft. It lived in the space between the body and the soul, between what could be touched and what could only be prayed away. A physician was not only a man of healing, but of humility, for more often than not, he had no cure to offer, only comfort. His tools were few, a mortar and pestle, a collection of dried roots and leaves, perhaps a worn copy of an ancient medical text, its Latin faded with use. There were no thermometers, no microscopes, no antiseptics, only the hand, the eye, and the whispered wisdom of Galen and Hippocrates. The woman lies on the straw-stuffed cot in the corner, her breaths shallow and uneven. The doctor works in silence, brewing a thin tea of willow bark and chamomile. He presses a damp cloth to her brow and murmurs a prayer, more out of habit than hope. He knows that the fever may pass, or it may not. He has seen both outcomes many times. In this moment, he is less a man of medicine than a witness to whatever course fate has chosen. Outside, the village slumbers, but within this small house, time has slowed. The candle guttering in the corner is the only measure by which the hours pass. The doctor sits beside the woman through the night, occasionally dosing her with his bitter concoction. He listens to her breathing, counts the beats of her pulse with the touch of 2 fingers. There is no sleep for him tonight. That, too, is part of the calling. To be a doctor in the Middle Ages was to live in a state of near constant vigilance. Illness did not keep to daylight hours. It crept in during the stillness, during storms, during moments of celebration. And so the healer, whether educated in a university or taught by the forest and field, remained always on the edge of rest. For each knock on the door might bring a child coughing blood, or a laboring mother, or a man pale with plague. But it was not all death and darkness. There was a certain peace in the work, a rhythm, the grinding of herbs, the steeping of teas, the careful turning of pages. Each illness was a puzzle, and though most could not be solved, the attempt brought its own strange satisfaction. In many ways, the medieval doctor was as much a steward of belief as a servant of health. The people trusted him not because he always healed, but because he tried, because he listened, because he stayed through the night. As the first pale light of dawn seeps through the narrow window, the woman's fever begins to break. Her breathing deepens, and her skin loses its chalky hue. The doctor says nothing, but he allows himself a slow, tired breath. He gathers his notes and stirs the last of the fire. The husband offers a quiet word of thanks, his eyes shining with gratitude. The doctor nods once and sees them out, the chill morning air brushing his face as the door closes behind them. He returns to his table and begins to clean. There will be more visitors. There always are. The morning sun filters through the crooked window pane, its light catching the dust that dances lazily in the still air. The doctor sits quietly at his table once more, a steaming bowl of porridge before him. He eats without haste, the wooden spoon moving in slow, practiced circles. Sleep has not visited him, but he is used to that. In truth, he welcomes the quiet hush of morning, when the village is still waking and the burdens of the day have yet to arrive. This is his moment of reflection, brief as it may be. Beside his bowl lies a small leather-bound book, its pages well thumbed and stained with ink and herb. It is a copy of a medical manuscript, copied by hand many years ago, passed from one healer to another. Within its pages, there are diagrams of the human body, crude by modern standards, but cherished nonetheless. There are notes on the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These are the cornerstones of his understanding, the foundation of every diagnosis he makes. For in the Middle Ages, the body was believed to be governed by balance. Illness, therefore, was imbalance: too much heat or too much cold, too much moisture or too much dryness. And so, when a man arrives with flushed cheeks and a pounding head, the diagnosis is simple. His blood is too hot. The solution just as simple: let the blood out. The doctor rises from his stool and takes down a brass bowl, polished to a dull shine. He checks his knives, ensuring the edges are clean, if not sharp. In truth, there is little concept of sterility in his world. Boiling water is used more for tea than for cleansing tools. He has washed the blade in wine, a small comfort, and perhaps more ritual than reason. But it is enough. The patient is seated in the corner of the room, his sleeve rolled up, his eyes fixed on the wall. He does not flinch as the blade touches skin. The cut is small, precise. Blood wells up slowly, thick and dark, and drips into the waiting bowl. The doctor watches it carefully, noting the color, the flow, the patient's pallor. This is not guesswork. This is art. After several minutes, he presses a cloth to the wound and binds it tightly. The patient leans back, pale but calm. There is no talk of pain, no complaint. Bloodletting is familiar, it is trusted. It is one of the few remedies the people believe in without question. And though its effectiveness is doubtful, the ritual brings comfort. That alone is a kind of medicine. As the man departs, the doctor cleans the knife and pours the blood outside, careful to do so near the base of the garden wall. He has read that blood nourishes the soil. Whether this is true or not, he does not know. But habits, once formed, are hard to break. Not all patients come willingly. Some are brought by force, carried on makeshift stretchers by desperate relatives. One such case arrives just after noon. A young boy, no more than 10, shaking with fever, his limbs stiff and eyes glazed. The mother is frantic, weeping and clutching a rosary so tightly her fingers bleed. The doctor feels the boy's skin hot and slick with sweat. He pries open an eyelid and sees nothing but clouded white. This is not a case for bloodletting, not yet. Instead, he fetches his poultices, a blend of crushed fennel, rosemary, and a pinch of powdered bark, spread onto a strip of linen and placed on the boy's chest. He whispers a few words, something between a prayer and a diagnosis, and wraps the child in wool. The boy will either burn out the fever or be taken by it. The doctor knows this well. He has seen it before. As the sun climbs high, the room grows warm. The herbs hanging from the rafters release their scent, a sharp mix of mint, sage, and dried lavender. The doctor moves slowly, methodically, from one task to the next. He prepares more teas, grinds more powders, takes brief notes in his ledger. He writes not for others, but for himself. Records of symptoms, guesses, outcomes. Perhaps someday another healer will read these pages and find something useful. There is no hospital here, no apothecary on every street. Only this one man and the knowledge he carries. And though it weighs heavily on his shoulders, he does not lay it down. Not today. He glances at the boy again. The fever is holding. That is both good and bad. The mother continues to whisper prayers, her knuckles white around the rosary. Outside, a bell tolls somewhere in the village, its sound distant but clear. Another hour passes, another cup of tea steeped and poured, another entry scrawled into the ledger, and still the boy does not move. The boy sleeps at last. His breathing is shallow but steady, and the heat that once burned in his skin has begun to retreat. The mother dozes in a chair beside the cot, her head resting against the wall, the rosary still tangled in her fingers. The doctor moves quietly through the room, careful not to disturb them. He tidies the table, empties the tea bowl, and adds a few more dried leaves to his dwindling stores. There is a certain rhythm to these moments when the storm of illness pauses just long enough for a breath. In the quiet, he opens the cupboard beside his work table. Inside lies his collection, humble but treasured. A wooden box of metal tools, each nestled in cloth. the curved lancets for bleeding, the slender probes for inspecting wounds, a bone-handled scalpel dulled by years of use. There is also a bronze mirror, tarnished and cracked, but still capable of catching light. It serves no medical purpose, but he keeps it all the same, perhaps to remind himself that seeing is not always the same as understanding. Alongside the tools are his remedies, jars of crushed roots, oils pressed from wildflowers, and powders made from minerals ground into dust, each one labeled with faded ink. He knows them all by heart. Comfrey for broken bones, pennyroyal for cough, poppy seeds for pain. Some are useful, others, he suspects, are little more than tradition. But he uses them anyway. Sometimes belief is stronger than science. He reaches for a vial of wormwood and uncorks it. The bitter scent fills the room, sharp and earthy. He remembers the woman from the week before, her stomach twisted in knots, her skin yellow with sickness. The wormwood had helped, or perhaps time had. It is difficult to say. Healing is never a certainty, only an effort. Above the cupboard, hanging from a wooden peg, is his physician's robe, faded black, with a hood worn smooth at the seams. He wears it only when summoned beyond the village, to the manor house or the distant abbey. It is not for comfort. The thick wool scratches and chafes, but it lends him authority. And in a world where cures are few, authority often matters more than answers. When he does travel, he carries his satchel, worn leather, stitched and restitched, bulging with dried herbs, folded cloths, and bottles sealed with wax. He brings it now to the table and begins to refill it, just in case. A knock could come at any hour. It usually does. Outside, the village stirs. A dog barks. A cart creaks over the cobblestones. Smoke begins to rise from chimneys as cooking fires are kindled. The doctor hears it all through the window's thin glass. He listens, but does not move. He is watching the boy, whose brow has begun to sweat. A good sign. The body cools when the fever breaks. The doctor nods to himself and adds another note to his ledger. There is no payment yet. The mother has brought nothing but worry and whispered prayers. But that does not matter. He rarely charges the sick. Sometimes he receives eggs, a loaf of bread, a carving of wood. These small gifts line the walls of his home, not as trophies, but as reminders, each one tied to a patient, a story, a moment when healing felt almost real. He returns to the cupboard and draws out a small vial of rose oil, a luxury, certainly, but in cases of despair, it can calm the heart. He sprinkles a drop on the boy's cloth and another near the mother's chair. The scent softens the air, blending with the herbs and smoke. For a moment, the room feels less like a place of sickness and more like a sanctuary. Not all doctors have such spaces. In the cities, the sick crowd into narrow halls and pay high fees for consultations that offer little hope. Barbers double as surgeons, apothecaries sell powders of doubtful origin, and those who cannot pay are left to wander. But in the village, things are simpler, cruder perhaps, but also more personal. The doctor knows each face, each family. He has delivered babies and dressed wounds. He has sat by deathbeds and baptized the dying. His role shifts with each day, but the need remains the same. He sits again at the table and sharpens his quill. Ink is low, but he stretches it. He writes a recipe for a salve. Honey, goose fat, and powdered sage. It is not precise, but precision is a luxury. He relies on instinct, memory, and the feel of things. The salve is for a farmer's daughter with a sore that will not heal. He will deliver it later if time allows. The light fades slightly as clouds gather. Rain may come. He rises and shutters the window. In the corner, the boy stirs, and the mother wakes with a soft gasp. She blinks, unsure of where she is, then sees her son and exhales. The doctor gives a small nod. Nothing needs to be said. Not yet. The boy is resting again. His skin is damp, and the fever seems to be fading. The doctor watches in silence, his fingers wrapped around a cup of cooled tea. Across the room, the mother wipes her son's brow with a cloth dipped in rose water. She hums softly, barely above a whisper. The melody is old. A lullaby, perhaps. One passed from mother to child and back again, carried on the breath like prayer. Outside, the wind begins to rise. The trees sway gently, and the sky darkens with the promise of rain. The doctor turns toward the fire and adds a piece of wood. The flames catch quickly, casting flickering shadows on the wall. He sits once more and reaches for a bundle of dried plants hanging near the hearth. Mistletoe, mugwort, and feverfew, each one gathered by hand, each tied with simple twine. There is power in these herbs, or so he has been taught. Not all of it medical, not all of it understood. In the Middle Ages, illness was never just of the body, it was of the soul, a punishment, a trial, a test of faith. The doctor knew this, and so did his patients. When they came to him with trembling hands or aching joints, they often carried more than pain. They carried guilt, doubt, the fear that they had somehow angered God. It was not his place to argue. He was no priest, but he had seen enough to know that belief shaped suffering, and sometimes it shaped healing too. He remembered a woman from the spring before. She had come to him shaking, convinced she was cursed. Her neighbors whispered of bad omens, chickens dead in the night, milk gone sour, a strange mark on her arm. She had cried as he examined her, eyes full of fear. He had found nothing, no fever, no wound, but still she trembled. So he had offered her a charm, a pouch filled with sage and lavender, stitched with thread soaked in wine. He had whispered a few words over it, careful not to sound too confident. She had thanked him, and when she returned a week later, she was smiling. Sometimes belief is stronger than medicine, and sometimes belief is the illness itself. The doctor pulls his ledger close and flips to an earlier page. A list of symptoms: swelling behind the ears, rash along the spine, a boy of 12, now gone. His mother had sworn it was the work of spirits. The villagers avoided her after the burial. No one blamed them. Fear moves faster than reason. He sighs and sets the book aside. In the corner, the mother leans back in her chair. Her son stirs, but does not wake. The fire crackles softly. Somewhere beyond the village, a church bell rings twice. Mid-afternoon. He had not noticed the time passing. He stands and crosses to a shelf lined with small jars, ground charcoal, burnt bones, powdered oyster shell, remedies from distant lands acquired in trade or passed through wandering monks. Some are effective, others are mysteries. He takes down a jar of crushed myrrh and uncorks it. The scent is sharp, almost sweet. He sprinkles a pinch into a small bowl and adds a few drops of rainwater from a jar. The mixture darkens and thickens. He stirs it slowly, watching the swirl of color settle into a muddy paste. He dabs a little on a clean cloth and presses it to his own wrist. No reaction, no sting. That is good. He will use it later, perhaps for a rash or sore. He makes a note in the margin of his journal and closes the jar with care. Not all healing comes from herbs. The doctor keeps stones on his shelf, too. Smooth river rocks, a lump of amber, a polished piece of jet. Some call them charms. Others call them foolish. But to the sick they bring peace. And that, he thinks, is reason enough. He returns to the table and begins to clean his tools. The knife still bears a trace of blood. He wipes it with wine and cloth, then sets it to dry. The lancets are dull. He sharpens them with slow, deliberate strokes. The grindstone sings softly with each pass, a rhythm both familiar and quieting. Outside, the first drops of rain begin to fall. The roof creaks gently under the weight. The scent of damp earth drifts through the cracks in the shuttered window. The doctor closes his eyes and listens, not to the rain, but to the breathing in the room. Two steady sounds, soft and slow. The boy, the mother. The fire glows dimmer now, burning low but steady. He knows there will be more patients soon. There always are. The wind pushed at the shutters. The rain had passed, but the sky still hung heavy with gray. The doctor stood by the window, his eyes tracing the line of the road that led through the village and out toward the hills. It was quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. He waited for movement, for the distant figure of a messenger or a rider. But the path remained empty. Behind him, the fire crackled. The boy slept, curled beneath a wool blanket. His mother watched him closely, lips pressed together, hands folded in her lap. She had not spoken in some time. She did not need to. The doctor could see the tiredness in her eyes. He crossed the room and poured another cup of tea. The warmth soaked into his hands as he held it, fingers wrapped tight around the clay. He took a sip, then another. The taste was bitter, familiar. It reminded him of other evenings like this one, other storms, other silences. There had been a time years ago when the silence was heavier. It began with a cough, that was all, just a cough. Then a fever, then dark spots beneath the skin, swollen lumps behind the ears and under the arms. The people whispered of punishment, of sin, of death walking in the shape of man. The doctor remembered the first body, a girl of 15. Her father brought her wrapped in cloth. By the time they reached the house, she was already gone. He had seen her eyes once more when he closed the shroud. The illness moved quickly, too quickly for any salve or tincture. By the end of the week, 5 more had died. By the end of the month, he stopped counting. The graveyard filled, then the fields beyond it. Families vanished in days. Homes stood empty, doors swinging in the wind. He had stayed, not out of bravery, but because he did not know where else to go. Now, When the wind picked up and the road lay still, he remembered those weeks, the smell, the sounds, the stillness, the way the village felt when no one dared speak above a whisper. Some said the plague came from the rats. Others blamed the stars. Some pointed to sin, too much pride, too little prayer. The doctor did not know what to believe. He only knew how to watch and wait. He had burned his robe after that winter. The sickness clung to everything, to cloth, to breath, to memory. Now, when illness came, he looked for signs. A cough, a bruise that spread too fast. He had seen the way it began. He knew the patterns, and he had learned to listen for the silence that followed. The fire popped. He turned from the window and stepped quietly to the table. He opened his ledger and turned the page. His fingers paused. A name caught his eye. He ran his thumb across the edge of the paper, then slowly closed the book. The mother had fallen asleep. Her head rested against the wall. The boy stirred, but did not wake. Outside, the clouds shifted. A thin line of light broke through, casting a soft beam across the wooden floor. The doctor stood still for a long time. Then he moved to the cupboard and took down a fresh cloth. He folded it carefully, set it beside the ledger, and dipped a quill into the inkwell. The ink clung to the nib, heavy and dark. He did not write yet. Instead, he looked once more toward the road, still empty, but the wind had changed. The next morning came with frost, the kind that crept across the window glass in thin silver lines. The fire had burned low in the night, and the room was cold. The doctor stirred slowly, his back stiff from the wooden chair. He had not meant to sleep. He rarely did. But something in the silence had weighed down his eyes. The mother had gone. A folded cloth on the table and a single egg beside it told him she had left quietly. The boy still slept, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The fever had passed, at least for now. The doctor covered him with another blanket and turned toward the hearth. He added wood, poked the coals, and brought the room back to life. The knock came just after sunrise, sharp, 3 times. He opened the door to a man wrapped in furs, his boots caked in frozen mud. The man held a scroll tied with a red thread. No words were spoken. The doctor took the scroll, nodded once, and watched the man disappear into the pale morning. He unrolled the parchment. The seal belonged to the manor house. They were summoning him. The doctor moved quickly. He packed his satchel with the usual things, cloths, powders, bottles. He tied herbs into small bundles and slipped them between the pages of his notes. He put on his heavy cloak and fastened the brass clasp at his throat. He checked the fire once more, then closed the door behind him. The manor stood 2 hills away, a stone building with tall windows and a chapel that cast long shadows at noon. The road there was narrow and lined with trees. As he walked, the cold bit at his fingers. Birds called above him. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. He arrived near midday. The gates opened without question. Inside, the air was warmer, scented with oil and smoke. Servants passed silently, their faces tight with worry. No one spoke. A boy led him through the halls. Thick carpets muffled their steps. Paintings hung on the walls, their colors dulled by time. The room they entered was dim. A fire burned in a stone hearth. Curtains had been drawn tight against the light. In the center of the room, beneath heavy covers, lay a man, pale, eyes closed, breath shallow, the lord of the manor. The doctor approached without pause. He set down his satchel and knelt beside the bed. He felt the man's wrist, then his brow. The skin was cool but damp. He listened to the chest. The breath came in short gasps. There was something beneath the surface, a rattle. The doctor asked for water, warm cloths, and light. The servants obeyed. He uncovered the man's feet. They were discolored. A dark gray had begun to creep across the toes. The doctor frowned but said nothing. He took a knife from his bag, cleaned it with wine, pricked the man's arm. No blood flowed, just a trickle. Dark, slow. He asked for quiet. The room fell still. He reached for a jar of crushed fennel and mixed it with honey. He stirred until the paste thickened, then spread it on a cloth and pressed it to the man's chest. The scent rose like steam, bitter and sweet. The Lord did not stir. The doctor stayed by the bed for hours. He watched. He listened. He applied compresses. He whispered to the man, though he knew he might not hear. Sometimes words helped the living as much as the dying. When evening fell, he stood. The servants looked to him, waiting. He shook his head. Not yet. He asked for a place to rest, a small room, nothing more. They gave him one near the kitchen, where the heat from the ovens warmed the walls. He sat on a bench and poured himself a cup of water. His hands trembled slightly. He drank slowly, then reached for his ledger. He opened it to a blank page. He did not write the man's name, not yet. Instead, he drew a small line down the center. On one side, he wrote what he had seen, the signs, the color, the breath. On the other, he wrote what might come next. There were no certainties, only signs. He closed the book and sat in silence. The heat of the kitchen pressed against his back. The sounds of chopping, stirring, and quiet steps filled the air like a steady heartbeat. He would wait. The night was still young. The small room near the kitchen was warmer than the halls above, with thick stone walls that held the heat from the ovens and muffled the sound of footsteps in the night. The doctor sat on a low bench near the fire, a bowl of water cooling at his feet, and his satchel resting on the worn table beside him. He had not removed his cloak, though the weight of it pulled at his shoulders, and the dampness of the fabric clung to his sleeves. The manor house was quiet, as it often was during illness. Servants passed in silence, eyes turned downward, hands clasped together, even when they carried nothing at all. Grief made people quieter, and fear did the rest. No one wanted to say the wrong thing, or be the one to carry bad news from one end of the building to the other. He sipped slowly from a cup of broth brought to him an hour ago, its surface now covered in a thin film of cooling fat. The taste was dull but warm, and the act of eating gave him something to hold on to while he waited. The ledger on the table remained open, untouched, since he had last written the symptoms. He had not turned the page, had not recorded any outcome. It was too early for that. Upstairs, the lord of the manor continued to breathe, though each breath came thinner than the one before. The spots had spread from his legs to his belly, and the color in his lips had gone dark. The doctor had done what he could. Compresses of rosemary and wormwood, a weak syrup of poppy and elderflower, cloth soaked in boiled vinegar and laid over the chest. There was little more to try. He turned toward the hearth and stirred the fire back to life with the iron poker, watching the embers shift and collapse inward like the ribs of a burned house. The heat helped his joints, which ached more each winter. He pulled his hands inside his sleeves and rubbed them together slowly, feeling the roughness of skin that came from years of grinding herbs and washing cloth. In his satchel were 3 glass vials, each marked with fading ink. One held oil pressed from wild garlic, another a thick paste made from ground fig and wine, and the third was a liquid he had received from a traveler who claimed it came from the East. It had a bitter smell and no clear use, but he carried it anyway, unsure if it was medicine, poison, or both. There were books, too, though fewer than he would have liked. Pages of copied texts, prayers disguised as cures, and diagrams of the human body that looked more like maps than truth. He had read them all more than once, searching not for answers, but for memory, his own memory, and the memory of those who had written before him, men who had also waited in rooms like this one, with firelight on their backs and silence in their mouths. He thought of his own house, quiet now in the village, where the shutters would still be drawn and the boy would still be sleeping. The mother would have returned by now. She would sit beside her son, dipping cloth into cool water and whispering over his hands. She would not know where the doctor had gone. She would not need to. A sound in the hallway brought him back. The steps were slow, not hurried, but purposeful. A young servant entered the room, her apron damp, her fingers red from carrying wet linens. She said nothing, but paused near the table, her eyes on the floor. He stood before she spoke. "The master is still breathing," she said, her voice so soft it barely reached him. "But the priest has been sent for." He nodded once. The girl turned and left. He did not return to the fire. He gathered his things and closed the ledger without writing another word. The cup of broth remained half full, forgotten. The candle near the door flickered once, then settled. He stepped into the hallway and listened again. The stillness had returned. The hallways near the Lord's chambers were colder than the rest of the manor, with tall windows covered in thick curtains that let no light through. The doctor moved quietly, his footsteps nearly silent against the stone floor. He passed a row of paintings, faces of men and women long buried in the family crypt, their eyes watching from the walls with the same stillness he had seen in the sick. They did not speak, but something in their painted gaze seemed to follow him as he walked. He reached the door and paused. Inside, the fire had been reduced to glowing embers. The room was dim, lit only by 2 candles and the dull light from the hearth. A servant stood near the wall, arms folded, face pale. At the center of the room, beneath thick blankets and a woolen cloak draped across the legs, the Lord still breathed. It was shallow and uneven now, with long pauses between each sound. The doctor listened for a moment, then moved to the side of the bed. The priest had not arrived yet. He removed his gloves and laid a hand against the patient's forehead. The skin was cold, but the sweat remained, a sign that the body had not given up completely. He reached for a clean cloth, dipped it into a bowl of warm water, and pressed it gently to the man's temples. The scent of sage drifted up. He had added it earlier, hoping it might calm the spirit, even if it did nothing for the flesh. The servant remained in place. She did not speak, did not move. The doctor glanced toward her once, but she kept her eyes on the floor. He pulled his ledger from the satchel again, opened to the same page, and marked a new line. The breath slows, hands unmoving, eyes closed. Sweat remains? He closed the book, not because he had finished, but because he knew no more would be written today. His thoughts wandered as he watched the dying man, not to cures or signs, but to other bedsides, in other places, with other names and other prayers. He remembered a woman in a village to the west who had clutched a wooden cross so tightly her fingers had bled. She had asked only one question again and again. "Will it hurt?" He had answered, though the answer had changed nothing. That was years ago. He sat by the fire and stared at the embers. They pulsed with faint light, like the slow beat of a tired heart. The sound of breath behind him rose and fell with uneven rhythm. It was not peaceful, but it was not frantic either. It simply was. The doctor thought about his own breath, the rhythm of it when he walked, when he carried the satchel, when he leaned over the sick. He had learned long ago to control it, to make it steady, to slow it when others could not. Sometimes he wondered if his calm voice and still hands were more healing than the herbs he carried. He did not sleep, though the hour passed slowly. The wind picked up outside. One of the curtains stirred. A candle flickered. Still, the priest did not come. The servant moved once to place a fresh cloth at the bedside, then stepped back without a word. The silence of the manor deepened, as though every stone waited with the same patience as those who lived within it. The doctor did not speak. There was nothing left to say. In the dim light, the Lord's chest rose again, then paused. The doctor did not count the seconds. He had done that before, in the past. Counted and waited. Waited for the final breath. Waited for the stillness that would not break. But not tonight. Tonight, he only listened. When the door opened, it did so without sound. A younger priest stepped inside, robes gathered, face drawn with fatigue. He nodded to the doctor, then to the servant, and crossed to the side of the bed. His voice was low, not more than a murmur, as he began to speak the familiar prayers. The doctor stood. He stepped back from the bed, pulled his cloak tighter, and turned toward the window. He opened the curtain. The sky outside was not yet morning, but the stars had begun to fade. The road back to the village was soaked with morning frost. Thin sheets of ice clung to the sides of the path, and the low grass shimmered beneath the first touch of light. The doctor walked alone. His satchel hung heavily at his side, and each step sent a quiet sound into the stillness around him. There were no carts that morning, no men leading animals, no children chasing one another along the fences, just cold air and the rhythm of his boots pressing into the mud. The manor had not yet sent word. The Lord still lived, or perhaps he did not. But the doctor was no longer needed. He had been thanked, given bread for the road, and a silver coin folded into cloth. He had placed it in the corner of his bag without a word. Payment was a custom, not a gesture. He did not think about coins. The path narrowed near the river. Thin trees leaned overhead, their bare branches sharp against the pale sky. A crow moved along the edge of the field and paused to watch him pass. He did not stop. He had walked this route many times, in every season, in every kind of weather. He knew which rocks to step over, which turn would bring him to the lower pasture, and where the hedges began. As he neared the village, he could see the rooftops. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney of the baker's house. The rest remained dark. Most windows were still closed, curtains drawn, doors latched. It was early, it was cold, and it was one of those mornings that made people stay in bed longer, pressing their bodies close to fire or to one another, hoping the chill would lift before they stirred. He passed the church without turning his head. Its bell had not rung since the last wedding, and the sound of it still lingered in memory. A dry tone, not high or low, just flat and final. The priest had grown old. His eyes were dim now, and his hand shook when he read, but his voice still carried when needed. The doctor wondered if he had already heard of the summons from the manor. News moved fast, even when people did not speak aloud. The first person he saw was a young boy carrying a jug of water. The boy looked up, nodded, and kept walking. That was enough. No questions, no remarks. A nod was enough to say he had returned. The doctor reached his door and paused. He looked up at the sky. The clouds had begun to shift. There was no sun yet, but a line of brightness cut across the edge of the trees. He opened the door slowly and stepped inside. The room was as he had left it, the hearth cold, the chair empty. A basket sat near the wall, filled with folded linen. The smell of dried herbs still clung to the air. He placed his satchel on the table and removed his cloak, draping it over the back of the chair. The sound of fabric sliding against wood was louder than expected. He poured water into the basin and washed his hands. The cold stung his fingers, but he did not flinch. He dried them on a piece of cloth that hung near the door, then turned toward the shelf where his tools were kept. He checked each one, the vials, the folded papers, the small jars sealed with wax. Nothing had been moved. He sat down and opened the ledger. The page from the manor was still blank where the final line would go. He wrote the name of the Lord. He paused, then left the space beneath it untouched. Not today. He would visit again if needed. He leaned back and closed his eyes. His shoulders ached. His knees stiffened when he sat too long. He ran a hand across his face and felt the roughness of his beard. He would shave later, or not at all. There was no one to notice. Outside, someone called for a child. A dog barked once, then silence returned. The doctor stood again and moved toward the fire. He added kindling, struck the flint, and waited for the flame to rise. The warmth came slowly, but it came. He sat near it and rested his hands in his lap. There would be another knock, another house, another face. There always was, but not yet. Not this morning. By the time he left the manor, the first line of daylight had begun to stretch across the edge of the horizon, revealing long shadows between the hills and a thin mist hanging low above the road that wound down into the fields. The cold was sharper than before, and though he had pulled his cloak tight around his shoulders, the dampness still crept in through the seams, settling along his arms and around his spine like fingers pressing lightly against his ribs. Each step forward stirred the frozen mud beneath his boots, the quiet crunch breaking through the otherwise silent morning. He had not spoken much when he departed. A servant had met him near the entrance, thanked him politely, handed him a pouch with 2 small coins and a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, and nodded once more before retreating back into the stone corridor. It was always like that, neither celebratory nor sorrowful, just necessary. There was no news to give, not yet. The Lord was still breathing, though with every passing hour that breath grew thinner, like the fading threads of a garment worn through by time. The priest would remain. The family would wait. The road led him back through the same trees he had passed the evening before, their bare branches now lined with frost and early light, and he walked in the same way he always did, without urgency, but without pause, his thoughts shifting between what he had seen and what would come next. There was no moment of reflection, no sudden insight, just the rhythm of the road, the weight of the satchel at his side, and the knowledge that another house, another knock, would eventually follow. As he reached the edge of the village, the roofs appeared first, dark against the gray sky, with only a few chimneys breathing smoke into the air. Most shutters remained closed, and the streets were still, except for a cart near the well, where a young man shoveled straw into a pile beside 2 empty buckets. The doctor walked past him without a word, and the man did not turn his head. That was normal. Recognition in silence. A figure in a cloak meant someone had fallen ill, or might soon. He arrived at his door and opened it slowly, not from hesitation, but habit. Inside, the room was just as he had left it, cool, quiet. The fire burned out, the linen still folded on the bench beneath the window. He placed the satchel on the table, removed his gloves, and stretched his fingers slowly, as if reacquainting himself with his own hands. There was stiffness in the joints, more than before, and he would need to soak them later. But not yet. The cloak came off next, draped carefully over the back of the chair, and then he moved to the hearth, where he added kindling and bent to strike the flint. The spark caught quickly. A small flame rose. He sat back on his heels and watched it grow until the first wave of warmth reached his knees. He did not speak. There was no one to speak to. The house remained still. When the fire was steady, he stood again and removed the ledger from the satchel. He placed it on the table and opened it to the same page he had written in at the manna, the line still clean, the ink dry. The name was there, the symptoms, the timing, but the outcome remained unwritten. He considered the space, held the quill for a moment, then placed it down again without marking anything more. From the shelf above the table he pulled a small tin jar and opened it. Inside was a dried mixture of crushed root and bitter leaves. He placed a pinch of it beneath his tongue and waited for the taste to settle. It would not heal anything, but it steadied his breath, helped with the chill that lingered after long nights in cold halls beside dying men. He moved to the window and pushed open the wooden shutter. Outside, the light was spreading, soft and slow, across the rooftops and into the narrow streets. A child ran from one doorway to another, holding a loaf of bread in both hands. A woman stepped into the yard with a bucket of water and poured it carefully into the trough near the fence. Life was returning to the village, not loudly, not suddenly, but in the quiet way it always did after the night had passed. The doctor watched for a while, then stepped back and closed the window again. He sat by the fire, his hands resting in his lap, the smell of ash and warm wood curling up toward the beams. There would be work again soon. There always was. The morning hours passed slowly, as they often did when there was no place to be, and though the doctor kept himself busy with small tasks, there was no urgency in his movements. He boiled water for the basin, wiped down the table, and examined each of the jars on the upper shelf, checking for moisture or mold that might have crept in during the colder weeks. The herbs he had gathered in the summer still held their scent, though faintly now, and he ground a small handful of dried valerian root between two stones until the dust rose in soft spirals toward the beams above. From the cupboard he took a folded piece of parchment, untouched since the autumn, and placed it beside the ink pot. The parchment was blank. He had considered writing to a colleague in the next province, someone who had once studied in the South and returned with strange ideas about blood and wind and heat. But the letter had never begun. The words felt unnecessary, as if putting them to paper would only confirm how little had changed. He sat at the table for a long time, pen in hand, the tip resting near the center of the page, not moving. Outside, a dog barked twice. A cart rolled past the house. A man called out to his son from across the yard, his voice low and half lost in the distance. The doctor listened, not because he cared about what was said, but because the sounds reminded him of the ordinary, and the ordinary was something to hold on to. When the ink began to dry along the edge of the pen, he set it down again and leaned back. His thoughts drifted to the boy with the swollen neck, the one he had seen days ago near the edge of the village. The swelling had not been painful, not yet, and the boy's mother had said it appeared suddenly, like a stone beneath the skin. He had told her to wait, to apply a poultice of salt and cabbage, and to send for him if it worsened. But there had been no word since. Perhaps it had gone away, or perhaps they had turned to someone else, the old woman near the orchard who offered charms made from ash and feather, or the blacksmith's wife who swore by burnt barley and prayer. He did not blame them. He knew what people whispered when he left their homes, that he brought sickness with him, that he was always near when death came, that his hands, though steady, were not always clean. But they still called for him again and again, because they did not know who else to trust, and because in the stillness of night, when a child burned with fever, or a man could no longer walk, someone had to knock on a door. He rose and moved to the cupboard again, removing a cloth bundle tied with string. Inside were letters, most of them old, some smudged by water or soot, others never opened. He unfolded one written by his father, dated from a time when the roads were still watched by soldiers and travel had been uncertain. The words were simple, without flourishes, a list of patients, a complaint about a stubborn wound, a note about a merchant who had paid him in salt instead of coin. There was no greeting, no farewell, just words written in the same hand he now used for his own records. He placed it back among the rest. There was comfort in the repetition of things, in the idea that the life he lived had been lived before, by others, and would be lived again after he was gone. The names would change, the faces, but the tools would remain. The ledger, the herbs, the waiting. A knock on the door pulled him back. It was not loud, not rushed. He stood and opened it to find a boy, no older than 10, standing barefoot in the frost, with a small cloth bundle pressed to his chest. He did not speak. He simply held it out. The doctor took it and opened the cloth. Inside was a folded piece of linen soaked in something dark. Blood, most likely, though not fresh. The boy finally looked up. "It's my brother," he said, his voice thin. "He fell from the cart." The doctor nodded and stepped inside, reaching for the satchel without needing to think. The boy led him through the fields behind the mill, following a path that was half worn by carts and hooves, with puddles frozen in thin sheets and old reeds gathered at the edges. The doctor walked in silence, his satchel pressed close to his side, each step careful and even, though the ground was uneven and softened from last week's thaw. The boy moved quickly, too quickly for the size of his legs, and looked back every few seconds, as if checking to make sure the figure in the dark cloak still followed him. They reached the cottage after a short while, a narrow wooden house leaning to one side, with smoke rising weakly from a cracked chimney, and 2 hens pecking slowly near the door. A woman waited at the threshold, her hands pressed together in front of her apron, eyes wide and red from crying. She stepped back as they approached, allowing the boy to pass and the doctor to enter without speaking. The room inside was warmer than expected, and the smell of boiled oats and wet wool filled the air like fog clinging to stone. The injured child lay on a straw mattress near the hearth, a boy of perhaps 12, his face pale, hair damp, lips parted. His right arm was bent at an angle that told the story before any words were spoken, and the cloth around his elbow had already stiffened from blood and dirt. His breathing was fast but shallow. There was no sign of fever yet, but that would come soon if the wound remained untouched. The doctor knelt beside him, opened the satchel, and placed the tools carefully on the worn cloth he carried for such things. There was no conversation, no explanation, only movement, the kind of movement that came from repetition, from knowing what must be done and how long it would take and where the risks would hide. He inspected the arm gently, pressing along the bone, watching the child's face for signs of pain. The boy's eyes fluttered but did not open. His body had taken the worst of the fall, and his mind had retreated to quieter places. The mother knelt nearby, whispering a prayer without sound, her hands shaking at her sides. The younger brother stood in the corner, holding on to the doorframe, staring at the floor. The doctor cleaned the wound first, using water warmed over the fire and a cloth soaked in boiled rosemary. Then he reached for the small jar of paste he had made the week before, a thick mixture of ground bark, honey, and a pinch of wormroot, and applied it to the broken skin before wrapping the arm in clean linen. The bone would need to be set, but not yet. Not while the boy drifted between breath and sleep and pain that had not yet settled. He prepared a draught of poppy and elderberry, stirred it carefully, and tilted the cup to the boy's lips. A few drops slid in, enough to ease the pain, but not enough to silence the body completely. Then he turned to the mother, who still knelt beside the hearth, and spoke for the first time since entering the house. "He will need to remain still for many days," he said, his voice even. "The bone is not shattered, but it is not clean. It will set badly if he moves." The woman nodded, tears still on her cheeks. "You must keep the fire lit," he added. "The cold will make the blood run slower." She nodded again. He wrapped the tools once more, returned them to the satchel, and pulled the ledger from the side pocket. On a fresh page he wrote the time, the name, the age of the child, the nature of the wound, the materials used. His script was narrow, precise, leaning slightly to the right, like his father's had done before him. Each letter the same as the last, a language of memory and method. The boy in the corner had not moved. The doctor turned toward him and said nothing. The child looked up only briefly, then turned away. He stood, adjusted his cloak, and gave the woman a small pouch with dried leaves for steeping, instructions for each marked on a folded scrap of parchment. He told her to watch for fever, to listen to the breathing, to keep the linen dry and clean. She thanked him, but her voice broke before the words could form completely. He stepped back outside into the cold morning light. The frost had melted near the door, leaving patches of wet soil between the stones. He walked the path in silence, his feet tracing the same marks they had made earlier, though the wind had changed, and the air now carried the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. There would be more houses like this, more mothers with tired hands and children too weak to speak, and always, somewhere, the next knock. The house was quiet when he returned, and though the fire had burned low during his absence, the air inside still held the warmth of ash and coal and old stone that had gathered the heat over long hours. He removed his cloak, hung it beside the door, and set the satchel down on the table with the same careful motion he always used, as if the contents inside were fragile, though most of them were not. The tools were made of iron and wood, the jars thick with wax seals, the cloths folded tight and stained from past visits. But habit made him move as if each object were something that could break if handled with too much haste. He washed his hands at the basin, fingers stiff from the cold, the skin near his knuckles dry and beginning to crack again. The water was cold, colder than expected, and for a moment he let it run over his wrists and felt the ache rise along the tendons. Then he dried them with the cloth near the hearth, sat beside the fire, and leaned back until the heat reached the soles of his feet. He did not think of the boy or the mother or the look on the younger brother's face. Not directly, but their presence lingered, not as images or words, but as a shape in the air, a pressure that remained even after the memory had begun to fade. He considered the supplies. The jar of ground bark would need to be refilled. The rolled linen near the bottom of the shelf had been used too often. He would have to boil it again, press it flat, hang it near the chimney for drying. There was always something to be prepared, even when there were no names on the list, even when no messenger waited at the door. Illness did not wait, nor did accidents or fever or the weakness that crept in through wounds that should have healed but never did. He rose and moved to the back wall, where a small drawer held the records of the last season. He sorted through them without reading, only checking the marks he had made, the number of visits, the distance traveled, the notes beside certain names that meant payment was still owed. Some, he knew, would never be repaid. He did not mind. It had been that way for years, and though there were times when the lack of coin meant fewer roots in the bag or less bread on the shelf, he had never stopped visiting the ones who could offer nothing. A man had once told him, long ago, that a good doctor measured his worth not in coin, but in the number of people who opened their doors without fear. At the time, he had nodded politely, not because he agreed, but because there was nothing to say in return. Now he understood it more clearly. The trust did not come easily. It was earned in quiet hours, in still rooms, in the soft rustle of linen being wrapped around a wound. Outside, the light began to shift. He stood again and opened the window. The wind had changed direction. It came now from the east, sharp and dry, carrying with it the faint scent of something burned. Wood, likely, though it could have been anything. Someone tending to old branches, someone warming an oven before dawn. He closed the shutter and stepped back, watching as the fire flickered once, then returned to steady flame. He did not expect visitors that night. There had been too much frost, too many closed shutters along the road that morning. People stayed inside when the wind came like this, when the air turned bitter and the smoke from chimneys moved in long, flat lines above the rooftops. It was the kind of cold that made bones ache and breath slow, and thoughts linger too long on things that could not be changed. He sat again, picked up the ledger, and read back through the last few entries. Each one told a story in pieces. The girl with the bleeding gums, the farmer's wife with the bent spine and the shaking hands, the old man who forgot his own name but still remembered the sound of the bell. He had written their names, marked the time, noted the signs. None of it was enough to stop what would come, but it gave the illusion of control, and sometimes that was what mattered. Not the cure, not the answer, just the presence of someone who had seen it before and would stay until the end. He paused at the last entry, a single line left unfinished. He turned the page. The blank sheet waited without expectation. He had not thought of the plague for some time, though the signs still lingered in the village, not the disease itself, which had faded years ago, but the way people looked over their shoulders when a child coughed too loudly, or when the bell rang, twice in the same day. The fear never truly left. It simply moved deeper, like water beneath stone, waiting for the next crack to rise again. He remembered the first year clearly, more clearly than he wished. The suddenness of it, the confusion, the questions that no one could answer. People stopped shaking hands. They burned their clothes. Some refused to leave their homes at all. Others vanished into the woods and were never seen again. He had not been the only one treating the sick back then. There were two others in the surrounding valleys, both older, both now gone, and they had tried to write letters to one another, exchanging thoughts on symptoms, on possible causes, on the smell that clung to those who died. The letters came less often as the months passed, and by the end of the second winter he no longer expected them. He kept the last one folded in the back of the ledger, still sealed, unopened. He had never had the courage to read it. He had carried vinegar in a small flask, soaked his gloves in it, tied dried lavender in strips of cloth across his face. It had not helped. Nothing had. The dead were buried in long trenches near the edge of the pasture, far from the wells and the roads, and no one marked the places with stone. There were too many, and no one wanted to be reminded. The ground had hardened early that year, and men broke shovels trying to dig through the frozen soil. At one point, they used fire to thaw the ground, and the smell stayed for days. He had watched as strong men fell within hours, as children grew quiet and stopped asking for water, as women who had never been ill before took to their beds and never rose again. There had been no pattern to it, no order. The rich and the poor, the clean and the filthy, the cautious and the bold, all touched in the same way with the same result. The sickness came quickly, and once it entered a house, there was little to do but wait. Now, years later, he still measured fevers with the same quiet dread, still checked for swellings behind the ear, still smelled the breath of the dying for that same sour rot that had once haunted the air for weeks. He did not speak of those days unless asked, and even then he kept his answers short. The people who had lived through it did not need reminders, and the young did not want to know. They believed it had passed, like a storm, like a strange season that would never return. But he knew better. He had seen the way it moved, the silence it brought, the emptiness that followed. And though he no longer feared it in the way he once had, he still folded a length of cloth into his bag each spring, still refreshed the rosemary and the vinegar, still checked the village road each morning for signs of gathering crows. That winter he had lived in the chapel, the only building still open after the second wave had passed. The priest had locked the church doors and slept behind the altar. The doctor had stayed in the vestry, wrapped in a cloak too thin for the cold, eating only what the grave digger brought. It was there that he began to write the names, one by one, in narrow script, without comment, a list of the gone. He sometimes looked at those old pages, not to remember, but to understand. The handwriting had changed, the ink had faded, but the names remained, not as people, not as voices, just marks, records. He wondered whether that was what he too would become, a line on a page in someone else's ledger, a name written without comment. He rose from the fire and moved toward the shelf where the older volumes were kept. Most were closed with string, covered in a layer of dust that softened the leather and dulled the corners. He opened one and turned the pages slowly, his thumb sliding over the edges until he reached the part he had written during those cold months. The list was longer than he remembered. He did not stop to read it. He closed the book again and returned it to its place. Outside, a gust of wind pressed against the window pane. He stood still, listening. Then he returned to the fire, sat once more, and let the silence stretch around him. It had been some months since he last walked beyond the main road, past the eastern boundary of the village where the trees grew denser and the moss covered the stones that once marked the edge of an old path now long forgotten. There was a cottage hidden there, far from the fields and the sound of the bell, where a woman known simply as the herbalist had lived for nearly 2 decades without once entering the village square. She was not feared exactly, nor was she welcomed, and though most spoke of her only in hushed tones, they still sent their children to fetch elderflower from her garden when the coughs would not break, or asked for her bark tea when a fever would not settle. He had worked with her once, long ago, when he was still young and uncertain, when his hands had not yet formed the habits they now performed without thought. She had taught him how to bind yarrow for travel, how to dry dock root properly without losing its heat, how to mix crushed violet with white ash to ease the swelling in joints. Her voice had been low and even, her movements slower than his, but always precise. She had kept no records, no ledgers, only memory, a memory built on hundreds of repetitions, seasons of picking and crushing and boiling and pressing. She had refused coin always. If someone offered it, she would turn away. If they insisted, she would return it by leaving it on their doorstep the following day. The doctor respected that, even if he no longer practiced the same way. There were times when he thought of her methods, especially when faced with wounds that resisted poultice and prayer alike. And he would remember how she had once said that not every sickness wished to be healed, and not every body fought to live. He had passed her house earlier that week on his way back from the miller's wife, and noticed the gate left open. That was unusual. She had always kept it closed, not locked, but firm against the wind and the creatures that roamed too close during cold months. He had meant to return, to check, but other calls had pulled him in different directions. Now, with the sky dimming and the wind soft against the tops of the trees, he found himself standing at her path again. The gate still hung open. The garden was silent. The pots that once overflowed with creeping thyme and yellowroot now sat dry. The soil cracked, the leaves withered and gray. He stepped through quietly, boots brushing against the brittle stalks, and reached the door. It was not barred. He knocked once. No answer. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs, left too long in stillness. He moved slowly, not out of fear, but reverence. The shelves were lined with jars, most of them sealed, some labeled in faded ink, others marked with strings and colored thread. A bundle of nettle hung near the window, forgotten, and beside the hearth sat a basket of dried rose hips, untouched. Then he saw her, not in bed, not collapsed, but seated in her old wooden chair, hands resting in her lap, eyes closed, as if caught mid-thought. There was no panic in her face, no struggle, only quiet. She had gone as she had lived, without announcement, without interruption. He stood for a long time, unsure of what gesture to make, unsure if any was required. He stepped forward and placed a hand gently on her wrist. Cold, long past breath. He looked around the room once more. On the table beside her chair rested a small iron hook, worn, curved, wrapped at the end with a strip of old cloth. He remembered it. She had used it to lift the lids from her boiling pots, to pull bundles of leaves from hot water, to hang pressed roots along the beam above the fire. He reached for it, not to take, but to understand why she had set it there, alone, as if leaving behind a message not written in words. He left the house without disturbing anything else. At the gate he paused and closed it behind him. There was no one to tell, no one to ask what should be done. But he would return in the morning, bring linen, prepare the ground near the trees. She had no family, no stone, no page in the village record. Only the jars. Only the names whispered by those who never saw her face. That evening, after returning from the edge of the woods, he did not light a candle. The room held enough of the day's last light to see the outlines of the shelves, the lines of the table, the familiar curve of the iron basin that stood near the hearth. He sat without removing his cloak, the smell of dried nettle and smoke still clinging to the fabric, and listened to the creaking of the beams above his head as the wind shifted again. Somewhere outside, a barn door thudded once, then silence. He took the ledger from the corner shelf, turned it in his hands, and opened it to a page halfway through. There were lines marked with names he no longer remembered, illnesses that had passed quickly, some with recovery, some without. He had grown used to writing without emotion. The act of recording served its purpose, and once the words were written, he rarely returned to them. But on this page, between two dates marked in the coldest weeks of the last frost, he had written something in the margin. It was not a note about a patient. It was a sentence, short and strange. She still keeps the jars in rows, though the seasons do not ask her to. He read it twice, unsure of when it had been written or why. He could picture the rows, of course, the jars on the herbalist's shelves, arranged not by size or color, but by some logic only she understood. Some had markings, some did not. Some were placed upside down, others with a sprig of something dry beneath the lid. He had never asked why, and now it did not matter. He folded the ledger closed and placed it on the table, then stood and moved toward the shuttered window. A thin crack of light came through between the boards, enough to see the movement of the wind across the frost-covered grass outside. There would be no calls that night. The village had grown still again, as it always did when the moon was thin and the wind steady. The quiet had its own weight, one he had learned to carry without resistance. He lit the small fire with care, feeding it slowly, not for warmth, but to boil water. There was linen to wash, still folded in the satchel from the morning visit. The blood had dried unevenly along the edge of one wrap, and he soaked it first, rubbing the cloth against itself until the water darkened. He worked without hurry. The fire cracked once, and a spark leapt toward the corner, fading before it reached the stone. The knock came late, not hurried, not loud. He dried his hands on the old cloth by the fire and opened the door. A man stood there, older than most, with a woolen cap pulled low and his hands pressed together as if he had been standing in the cold for some time. His breath showed faintly in the air. He did not speak right away. Then, in a voice rough from the cold or from use, he said, "It's my wife. She won't wake." The doctor stepped back, took the satchel, pulled the cloak around his shoulders, and followed. They walked along the road that curved behind the granary, a place he had not visited in several weeks. The man spoke only once, to say she had been ill for a day, maybe two, nothing that had seemed dangerous. He had made her broth. She had slept. Then, sometime before sunset, her breathing slowed. When he tried to wake her, she did not stir. The cottage was small and kept in neat order. A child's drawing was pinned beside the hearth, and two wooden chairs sat close to the coals, their backs worn smooth. He was led to the bed, where the woman lay with one arm across her chest, her hair damp, eyes closed. He checked the pulse, the breath, the color of her lips. She was still alive, but fading. The fever was low, the kind that did not burn but drained slowly, like water from a cracked vessel. He opened the satchel, began his work. A root infusion to stir the heart, linen soaked in wormwood and applied to the chest, a few drops of oil on the temples. Nothing strong, nothing that would harm if it failed. The man waited in silence, his eyes on the edge of the bed frame, never lifting. The doctor remained an hour, maybe more, then gave instructions, what to watch for, how to listen for changes in the breath, when to send for him again. He left a small pouch with ground clove tied tight with string. The man walked him to the door, said only, "Thank you." He nodded, stepped back into the cold, and began the walk home. The merchant arrived near midday, his horse thin from travel, its coat dull with dried mud and burrs. He did not dismount right away, only waited at the edge of the village square where the path split toward the granary and the mill. The doctor saw him from the window, watched as he leaned forward slightly, then sat back again, adjusting the thick wool scarf at his throat. His gloves were black leather, worn at the fingertips, and his coat bore the faded crest of a northern house that no longer traded in this part of the valley. There were not many who came from beyond the ridge these days. The roads were rough, and the snow had not yet melted fully on the higher slopes. Most merchants waited until spring, but this one had arrived early, with little warning, and when he finally stepped down from the saddle, his boots left deep prints in the soft earth. He led the horse to the post, tied it loosely, and turned toward the doctor's door. When the knock came, it was firm, but not hurried. The doctor opened it without a word. The merchant removed his glove before extending his hand, not in greeting, but in offering. The fingers were red, the nails dark at the edges. There was a tremor in the movement, small but clear. "I need something for this," he said. The doctor stepped aside and motioned for him to enter. The room smelled of boiled cloth and bitter root, and the merchant glanced once toward the shelf before sitting near the fire. He removed the other glove, revealing the same red skin, the same trembling. He unfastened the coat and let it hang open, breathing through his nose, lips pressed thin. The doctor asked no questions at first. He examined the hands, checked for warmth, for pulse, for signs of swelling beyond the surface. The nails were lifting slightly, and the skin beneath was cracked. Not frostbite, not illness. A reaction, perhaps, or poison. He looked at the man again. "What have you handled?" he asked. The merchant did not answer right away. Then, quietly, "Barrels, from the east. Something in the lining. The smell was strange." The doctor nodded once. He had heard of such things, not often, but enough. Oils used in sealing, powder to keep mold away. Some reacted with the skin, slowly at first. Then, with pain that spread through the joints, rising to the shoulders, the neck. He mixed a balm from a jar near the back of the shelf. Goat fat, crushed marigold, and a touch of soot. Spread it gently across the fingers, wrapped each hand in linen. The merchant sat still, eyes half closed, as if sleep had not visited him for several days. His breathing slowed, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "Will it stop?" he asked, voice low. The doctor looked at the hands again. "It will ease, not disappear." The man nodded, said nothing more. They sat like that for a while, the fire casting soft light on the floorboards, the smell of root and oil thick in the air. The merchant opened his eyes once to look around the room, noting the jars, the ledger, the empty chair in the corner. "You live alone," he said. The doctor did not reply. "Strange," the merchant added, not unkindly, "for a man who sees so many people." The doctor stood, moved to the shelf, took a small cloth bundle, and placed it beside the man. "Change the wrap each morning," he said. "Before you ride, keep the balm dry." The merchant nodded, slipped the gloves back on, slowly, careful not to pull the fabric too tight. He rose, stretched his back, and looked once more toward the door before turning. "I'll be heading north again," he said. "Might pass through in spring." The doctor gave no answer, only opened the door and watched as the man stepped outside, the wind catching the edge of his coat as he crossed the square. The horse waited, patient and thin, and soon the sound of hooves faded down the path. The room grew quiet again. He returned to the fire, folded the unused cloth, and placed it back on the shelf. There were always cases like this: hands damaged by tools, lungs burned from fumes, skin blistered from contact with herbs never meant to be touched. He had seen worse, but something in the merchant's voice lingered. Not fear, not pain. A kind of weariness that did not come from travel or injury. He looked down at his own hands, the skin pale, the lines deep. They no longer trembled, but they remembered. The morning had begun with mist across the fields, a thick, unmoving veil that clung to the stones and drifted low between the hedges, softening every edge of the familiar path. He had not yet taken his first step beyond the threshold when the sound of hooves reached him, slow, deliberate, not the hurried pace of a farmer bringing news, but the measured rhythm of someone who had traveled long and did not expect haste from others. He waited near the door, listening, and by the time the figure came into view, the mist had already begun to rise. The rider was a man wrapped in layers too fine for a commoner, with a thick wool cloak and black leather gloves that shone at the knuckles. His horse, thin and flecked with dirt, bore the weight of more than one saddlebag, though none were marked with symbols he recognized. The man did not speak when he dismounted, nor did he remove the gloves. He led the horse to the trough without looking toward the house, allowing the animal to drink before turning at last and approaching with a gait that suggested both caution and habit. The doctor opened the door before the knock came. The man nodded once without smile or introduction and entered with the quiet of someone used to closed rooms and low fires. He did not sit until invited. He did not remove his gloves until asked. They sat near the hearth, not speaking for a time, the only sound that of the fire cracking gently and the faint drip of water from the eaves outside. When the merchant finally stretched out his hands, the doctor saw what he expected: skin reddened at the joints, cracked between the fingers, darkening near the base of the nails. Not rot, not disease, a kind of chemical burn, slow and dry, the sort that came from long exposure to oil, perhaps, or to a powder sealed in damp barrels during transit. The merchant explained in few words: barrels brought from the east, something in the lining, a strange residue that had not been noticed until too late. He had handled them without care, trusting the seal, and now the damage had begun to settle in. The doctor worked in silence. He opened a jar of cooled tallow mixed with ground flower root, warmed a cloth in his palm, and pressed the balm gently into the folds of the man's skin. The merchant did not wince, but there was tension in his eyes, not from pain, but from something quieter, a fatigue not of the body, but of the road, of days passed in unfamiliar places, of the cold that settled into the bones and did not rise again until spring. The wrap was finished with linen bound in a spiral, fingers separated to keep the joints from stiffening. The merchant watched the process without speaking. When it was done, he flexed his hands once, slowly, and then rested them on his knees, palms upward, as if expecting nothing more. The doctor offered a pouch of salve and simple instructions. Reapply before nightfall, keep dry, avoid salt. The merchant nodded. "You've done this before," he said, not as a question. The doctor only returned to the shelf, replaced the jars in silence, and offered no reply. There were always men like this, traders who crossed rivers and borders with cargo no one else would carry, hands stained with resin and metal, lungs full of dust, boots cracked from miles, walked through frost and marsh. They passed through rarely and never stayed long, but each brought stories, even if unspoken, signs of sickness from the south, rumors of unrest in towns where the grain no longer came, quiet mentions of ships that failed to arrive. As the merchant stood to leave, he pulled his gloves back on with care, each motion slow, precise, as though the act itself mattered more than the protection. He did not shake hands. He did not offer coin. Instead, he placed a small strip of parchment on the table beside the satchel. A name, a place, a sign he would return, though not soon. The doctor watched as he crossed the square, the mist now nearly gone, leaving behind damp patches on the stone and the sound of hooves fading once again into the east. He closed the door softly. There would be time still before the next call. There was a cupboard in the corner of the old room he rarely opened any more, not from forgetfulness, but because it no longer held anything he needed. The latch creaked when lifted, and the wood, swollen slightly from years of damp air, resisted for a moment before yielding. Inside, the shelves sagged beneath the weight of forgotten bottles, cloth-wrapped bundles, dried plant stalks tied with black string and marked in a script that was no longer entirely his. He ran his fingers along the edge of the top shelf, brushing away the thin layer of dust, and paused at a small jar that still held the scent of dried wormwood, sharp and earthy, like the edge of a long memory not quite faded. He had once used it regularly, steeped in boiling water, left to cool, then pressed into cloth and laid gently across the foreheads of patients in the early stages of fever. It did not cure, but it slowed. That was often enough. There were few real cures in his work, few final victories. What he offered was delay, comfort, the long road instead of the sudden end. He had come to understand the worth of such things, not in words, but in the quiet nod of someone still breathing at sunrise. The jar had not been opened in some time. He turned the lid carefully, noting the faint resistance of the seal, and caught the scent again, bitter, dry, familiar. He left it open on the shelf, not to use, but to let the room remember it. Some part of him believed spaces held memory, that air and wood and stone could recall what had passed through them, even if no voice named it. The cupboard had stood there since his earliest days in this house, when the walls had still held a different color and the shutters had creaked with every gust. He had kept everything in it then, bandages, knives, pots of ash, cords for binding wounds, old bone tools carved by someone long dead. Now most of what he used was kept near the table, within reach, labeled and known. He sat for a time near the open cupboard, listening to the wind outside, It had changed direction again, coming now from the ridge, carrying with it the faint scent of wet earth and smoke. Somewhere, someone was burning the last of last year's thatch, clearing room for what would soon grow. He had always found that smell comforting, a sign of preparation, of purpose. He stood, closed the cupboard without latching it, and moved toward the shelf where the clean cloths were kept. He took 3, folded them, placed them in the satchel. He had not planned to visit anyone that afternoon, but there were signs he could not ignore. A note left on his door before dawn, unsigned, written in a careful but unfamiliar hand. 3 words: "She is not well." No name, no direction. But he understood. There were only so many households where a woman's silence would bring such quiet concern. He wrapped the scarf around his neck, checked the weight of the satchel, and stepped into the pale afternoon light. The path led north, past the rows of flattened barley, past the line of elder trees whose branches still held the dry remains of last year's fruit. The air was cool but not sharp, the kind of cold that lingered in the sleeves and fingertips but did not bite. He walked slowly, not from weariness, but from habit. The village had taught him this pace, unhurried, deliberate, listening as much to what was absent as to what was heard. At the crest of the hill he saw the house, small, slate-roofed, with a low stone wall that kept in more wind than livestock. The door was open, not wide, but enough, a sign in its own way. He knocked once out of respect, then entered. The room was warm, though no fire burned. The warmth came from the sunlight, filtered through the shutters, and from the bodies within. A man seated near the foot of the bed, unmoving, and a woman lying beneath a heavy blanket, eyes closed, mouth open just slightly. Her breath was slow but steady. He moved quietly, not greeting at first. The satchel was opened, the cloth removed. His hand rested gently on her forehead, then along the side of the neck. He checked the pulse, the temperature, the eyes. Nothing immediate, nothing sudden. But there was weakness, not in the body, but behind it, as though something once solid had begun to drift. He prepared a tincture of hawthorn and barley syrup, added a few drops of valerian, and gave instructions to the man without raising his voice. It would need to be given before sunset, and again before dawn. He remained until she stirred once, murmured a word he did not recognize, then fell quiet again. The man nodded, his eyes never moving from her face. The doctor rose, left the satchel open for the man to reach easily, and stepped outside. The wind had shifted again. There was an orchard at the far edge of the village, where the ground dipped slightly and the trees leaned inward, not from wind, but from years of growing too close together, as if seeking shelter in their own silence. Few came there now, not because it was forbidden, but because the path was uneven, and the fruit had long since gone wild. Apples that grew there were smaller, harder, with skins streaked in red and green that peeled easily under a blade, but left the fingers stained with something not entirely sweet. He had not walked that way in some months, not since the last frost, when he had been called to tend a wound that would not close, and had passed the orchard on his return, noting then only the stillness, the branches bare, the ground littered with rotted fruit. But that morning a boy had come to his door, no more than 10, his hands pressed together, his voice careful. "There's someone in the orchard," he said, eyes lowered. "He's not moving." No name, no further detail. The doctor wrapped the scarf twice, took the satchel without a word, and followed. The boy led him past the mill, past the lane where the cobbler lived, then beyond the last cottage to where the grass grew uneven and the moss crept between the stones. The trees came into view slowly, one after another, their branches dark with the memory of rain. They entered without speaking, the boy moving ahead, careful not to step on the larger roots. In the third row, near the base of an old tree whose bark was split with age, the doctor saw the figure, a man, perhaps 30, lying on his side, one leg bent, one hand resting near a broken branch. He was not dead, but close. The breath came slow, shallow, with a sound that suggested more than exhaustion. There was a wound on the back of the head, dried blood on the collar, and the fingers of the right hand curled tightly inward as if holding something that was no longer there. The doctor knelt, checked the pulse, lifted the eyelid, felt for the rise and fall of the chest. The boy stood back, watching without sound. He had done well. He had not touched anything. They moved the man carefully, lifting him onto a piece of canvas from the satchel, dragging him slowly through the trees, and then, when the path narrowed, carrying him between them. It took time. The boy's arms were thin but steady, and the doctor gave him no instructions, trusting that he understood. When they reached the edge of the orchard, a cart waited, not by design, but by chance. The driver knew the doctor, nodded once, and helped lift the man onto the wooden boards without asking what had happened. Back at the house, they laid him on the floor near the hearth. The boy left then, without being asked, and the doctor turned to his work. The wound was not deep, but old. 3 days, perhaps more. Infection had begun to settle beneath the skin, and the blood had crusted around the edges, sealing in more than it let out. He boiled water, crushed bark to powder, soaked cloth in vinegar, and pressed gently, slowly, until the skin gave way and the deeper layers could be seen. There was no fracture. That was something. He worked without sound, without thought, letting the habit guide his hands. When the man stirred, it was not with pain, but with confusion. He tried to sit, failed, then lay still again. The doctor did not speak, only placed a hand lightly on the shoulder, a gesture not of reassurance, but of pause. There would be time for questions later. For now, there was only breath and the work of keeping it. Outside, the light had shifted. Afternoon, pressing against the edge of evening. He moved to the cupboard, opened the middle drawer, and took out a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, broke it in half, and placed it near the man's hand. Not yet to eat, but soon. There were bruises along the ribs, the kind that came not from falling, but from boots or fists. He did not ask who had done it, not yet. The eyes were still cloudy, the voice not ready. He covered the man with the second blanket, folded the first cloth again, and rinsed the bowl in silence. The room smelled of herbs and vinegar and something else. Not blood, not sweat, but the lingering scent of bark oil, old linen, and damp earth from the orchard floor. He did not write anything in the ledger that evening, only placed the cloth wrap in the satchel again, refolded, still stained. There was a stone wall behind the apothecary's shed, built long before he had arrived, its purpose forgotten, its stones worn smooth by decades of rain and wind. Moss had taken root in the cracks, and in spring small flowers pushed through the gaps without needing permission. It had once been part of something larger, perhaps a pen or the corner of a stable, but now it stood alone, dividing nothing, keeping nothing in. He found himself there often in the early hours, before the shutters were opened, before the smoke from the village fires reached the lane. The ground was uneven but dry, and the sky above it was always the same shade of gray before dawn. He carried a small stool there one morning, not because of fatigue, but because he wanted to remain a while longer. The satchel rested at his feet, unopened. No calls had come in the night, no messages pinned to the door. The air was still. Far off, he could hear the slow rhythm of a hammer against iron, the smith working early again, though there had been no frost to force it. A thin column of smoke rose from the other side of the ridge, too distant to guess the source. Perhaps someone was clearing land, or burning cloth, or simply watching something smolder until it disappeared. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the ledger, not to open it, but to feel the worn grain of the leather. The pages inside were nearly full, each marked with dates, with names, with lines drawn in the margin where he had paused before finishing a thought. He had never kept a second copy. If the book were lost, so too would be the list of all he had seen, the quiet accounting of the small and fading lives that had passed through his door. But he did not worry. If the book were to vanish, the work would remain. That was enough. The stool shifted slightly beneath him as he leaned forward, reaching for a stalk of grass that had grown between two stones. It came up easily. The root was short. He twirled it once between his fingers, then dropped it. His hands were clean. The linen wrap he had used the night before had dried near the hearth, and now lay folded in the corner, waiting for the next wound. The bottles on the shelf were half full. The cupboards had not been touched in days. Still, he would check them again before nightfall, not from habit, but from the small wait that came when things were still and nothing demanded his hands. Someone passed on the road beyond the trees, a cart by the sound, its wheels heavy in the ruts. A dog barked once, then again, then fell quiet. He did not turn to look. The names would come again soon. Someone would send a boy with a message. A cough would linger. A child would fall. A woman would wake in the night and find her breath caught between heartbeats. There would be blood. There would be fever. The days would unfold as they always had. He rose without hurry, took the satchel by its strap, and walked back along the edge of the wall toward the house. The light had changed. The mist had lifted. The window near the table caught the sun for the first time that week, and the shadow of the shutter made a pattern on the floorboards. He stood for a moment in the doorway, listening, then stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Good night.